Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may find yourself. It's 5 o'clock in South Africa, and we are about to start. My name is Christy van der Westhuizen. I'm an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And you are at the State We're In conference, Democracies, Fractures, Fixes, and Futures. We will be unpacking democracy from all possible angles over the next few days. But let me immediately hand over to our Vice-Chancellor at Nelson Mandela University, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, to do the official opening. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor. Colleagues, I greet you this evening in the month of September, which is the Steve Biko week also for us. It is a bittersweet time for us as we both remember how and why Steve Biko died, but also as we celebrate his legacy, which is defining to our democracy. Our conference convener, program director and moderator for this evening, Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, head of the research program in the Center for Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela. Professor Andre Kiet, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Engagement and Transformation here at Nelson Mandela University, as well as the other Deputy Vice Chancellors that might be present here with us, the leadership of the university sector in our country and our partners, Professor Pamela Masego, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities here at Nelson Mandela University, Mr. Alan Zinn, who is the director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela. I greet you all, colleagues. I would also want to take this opportunity, colleagues, to acknowledge and greet our esteemed keynote speakers, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, of Universities of Columbia and University of Makerere University, and Associate Professor William Gumede from Wits University, Professor Caroline van Mal from the University of Free State, staff and students, colleagues from Mandela University and our sister institutions, conference attendees, and participants hailing from our country, our continent, and further afield. It is my pleasure indeed and honor to welcome you most warmly to this important conference. And if we were ever in any doubt as to its relevance and excellent timing, let me share with you that over the next 3 days, we will enjoy the intellectual largesse of 3 world-renowned keynote speakers, as well as a further 60 speakers hailing from 19 universities based in 10 countries over the course of 18 sessions. That said, colleagues, allow me a brief moment to thank our Nelson Mandela University team who have gone above and beyond in putting together this rich and diverse program that I am sure will accommodate all of our intellectual appetites. To these colleagues, I say, thank you for making this conference possible and for doing our university proud. I feel sure that I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that we look forward with anticipation and excitement to the engagements over the next few days. This conference is a collaborative and deliberative effort that showcases Mandela University's commitment to interdisciplinary scholarship, which features prominently on our institutional agenda as the university. Also, it is part of Nelson Mandela University's focus on its work on revitalization of the humanities. The conference is co-hosted by the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Engagement and Transformation, whom I've already acknowledged, and the Faculty of Humanities, headed by Professor Masego, alongside CANRAD. In addition to that, the Women and Gender Studies Center of the university and our Department of History and Political Studies will present invited symposia focusing on African feminism in the post-colony and policies and party politics in South Africa, in Ethiopia, and Uganda. This is a knowledge feast indeed. This conference, colleagues, features and displays a strong focus on African scholarship and its scholars. Academics from Uganda, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and South Africa will be brought into conversation and dialogue with scholars from elsewhere on the globe, ranging from India to Qatar, to Slovakia, to Northern Ireland, and to the USA. This is, of course, in keeping with our commitment to ensure that we remain relevant and we insert our voices into scholarly pursuits in all these geolocations across multiple disciplines. Pleasingly, also, the conference also features the full range of established scholars and emerging scholars, both within and outside South Africa, including several graduates as well as postgraduate students of our university. This too is in keeping with our commitment as a university to grow African scholarship and African scholars, and of course, to encourage intergenerational scholarly engagements. There can be no gainsaying that we are living in unprecedented times. Now more than ever before, in a world that is undergoing fundamental change and transformation, the role and purpose of the university and the nature and relevance of knowledge, who produces it and where it is produced, and are under intense scrutiny. Nothing is certain, more so in this time of the global pandemic, and the future at its best is opaque. It is in this dynamic and unpredictable context that democracy and its future are being newly engaged with. Such renewed thinking is necessary, colleagues, to understand how we can deepen democracy and address its contradictions and its limitations. Being in a country that has only recently transitioned to democracy after centuries of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles, it is imperative that we think through democracy, to strengthen democracy and find ways to make democracy live up to its promise of inclusion, its promise of equality, its promise of freedom and accountability, and above all, its promise of human dignity. This is especially important in the face of anti-democratic forces that seem to be rising everywhere, from this country and across our continent to the rest of the globe. It thus seems timely and appropriate for us, colleagues, to reflect on the workings of the nation state and history of this governmental system and the various threats that democracy faces in the 21st century. So I am sure that, like, you are looking forward to hearing Professor Mamdani's critique of the nation state and his oft reiterated assertion that there will be no decolonization, there will be no democracy, there will be no peace until we de-link the association between the nation and state power. Historically, pre-colonial polities in Africa, democratic and democratic forms of participation and decision-making. Colonialism interrupted these forms of governance with a legal division between settlers and natives, with the latter beholden to what Prof. Mamdani calls decentralized despotism. And I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you, Professor, on your latest work. While democracy was a clarion call of many liberation movements, most African states adopted authoritarian models of governance in the wake of independence. One discerns that in some countries, the espousal of democracy is selective in the extent that was and is often a smoke screen or indeed a facade for what are essentially forms of nationalism driven by ideology, race, culture, ethnicity, social status, elitism, and the like, the practice of which has resulted in grossly and deliberately unequal, unjust, and exclusionary regimes or nation states. While we wrestle with these complexities in Africa and many other nation states, we are simultaneously aware that globally, democracy seems to be increasingly vulnerable in the face of the re-entrenchment of socioeconomic inequality. Since the 1970s in particular, neoliberal capitalist economic policies have resulted in deepening socioeconomic inequality, with the gap between the rich and the poor widening globally. Here in South Africa, a 2020 study has shown us that 15% of the country's wealth is owned by only 3,500 individuals. The top 1% in this country controls 55% of all wealth. The top 10% in this country controls 86% of all wealth. In contrast, the bottom 90% of our population controls a mere 14% of the wealth. In this context, democracy cannot hold if socioeconomic exclusion is not decisively addressed and addressed fast. As the economic crisis continues and the wealth gap widens, democratic governance is criticized for being cumbersome, slow, and bound by red tape. For many, slow-moving democratic processes and governments that seem removed from the everyday concerns of their citizens suggest that democracy as a system fails them. While the South African Constitution contains socioeconomic rights, which has enabled, among other things, the largest social security system on our continent, these rights have still to be actualized for many South Africans. After many decades of struggle to overturn colonialism and apartheid and to establish a democratic South Africa, a worrying disillusionment seems to have set in over the past 27 years in this country. This can be seen by the trend of a continuing decrease in voter participation over the past few elections, when eligible voters are taken into account. At the same time, South Africa has come to be regarded as one of the most protest-intensive countries in the world. It is within scenarios of democratic skepticism, and indeed, if I can be honest, failure, that populists tend to arise, advancing rhetoric, promising economic and social solutions. Authoritarian populist leaders present themselves as the solution to a country's socioeconomic woes, and often utilize retrogressive attitudes on race, on gender, on sexuality to create an us and them othering mentality. We are seeing a pattern at the moment and proliferation of authoritarian regimes in the global north and south. And more concerning is that there are many citizens of these countries who favor populism over democracy. The attempted insurrection in the United States in January this year displayed for all of us that many Africans have more faith in an individual populist leader than they do in the checks and balances that hold democracy accountable. Echoes of these trends of backsliding democracy can also be seen in our own continent. While West Africa had been one of the first regions of Africa to embrace multi-party democracy in the final decades of the previous century, A second military coup in Mali within 1 year, as well as President Alassane Ouattara being accepted for a third term in Côte d'Ivoire, are troubling events indeed. The phenomenon of constitutional coups such as Uganda, Rwanda, Togo, and Chad have been worrying. Autocratic regimes continue in African countries such as Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. And in parts of Africa, there are also growing concerns of threats to journalists and to opposition leaders, for example. While some people might argue, and I'm not sure about this myself, that South African democracy has remained largely stable, there are real and visible concerns that it is under threat. Most worryingly, this was illustrated recently through public violence in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces in July here in South Africa, if you recall recently. It thus seems that the timing of this conference, colleagues, is apt, not only regarding marking the milestone of a decade of CANRAD's existence within the university, Nelson Mandela, but also as an ideal space for us to consider and think through democracy, its forms, its applications, and its futures. This conference, colleagues, which marks the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, aims to critically interrogate the state of democracy, tendencies, dynamics, and structural conditions globally and in South Africa by engaging its possible futures in the context of critical aspects such as constitutionalism, nationalism, and neoliberalism, democratic institutions, laws and accountability, party politics and political representation, the developmental state, indigeneity and traditionalism, African feminism, queer activism, land and rural struggles, Black identities, education, and social justice. Your contributions make a significant contribution to that end in the light of all the areas that the conference covers. As such, colleagues, allow me again to offer you our best wishes for a vibrant, exciting, and productive conference. A warm welcome to you from all of us at Nelson Mandela University.
Thank you so much to Professor Mutwa for those words. Much appreciated. And without further ado, let me hand over to our keynote, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. He is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and Professor of Anthropology and of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and also, of course, as we know, Director at Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974, and he specializes in the study of African history and politics, looking at the intersection between politics and culture, doing a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Prior to joining Columbia, Professor Mamdani was at the University of Dar es Salaam. He spent some time previously also at Makerere, and I think as most of us know, also at UCT here in South Africa. Some of his books include Neither Settler Nor Native, and that's what we will be hearing about this evening. Very excited about that. And also, of course, the book Saviors and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War on Terror, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, when victims become killers. And then I think also for many South African scholars and African scholars, Citizen and Subject has been a very influential book. And the good news is that now the Settler Nor Native has actually just been awarded the Herskovits Prize by the African Studies Association. Congratulations on that, Professor Mamdani. So Professor Mamdani will this evening speak to his latest book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. Let me immediately hand over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I thank the Vice-Chancellor, both for introducing me in generous terms and for the introduction to this conference. And I'd like to thank the organizers. I apologize for not being able to have the names at the tip of my tongue, but all the Deputy Vice Chancellors, the Deans, the organizing committee of this conference, it's an honor to be asked to give a keynote. I wish this could have been in person. We could have met in formal and informal circumstances, but maybe another day. Now, let me just state at the outset that as I started preparing this talk, I realized that it really would make no sense for me to talk about a book which you can buy, which is there. So I'm not really going to talk about Neither Settler Nor Native. Of course, some of the ideas will be from there. But this talk is, if I have to give a one-sentence description, it's about what I have learned from my engagement with South Africa. I first came to South Africa in 1993 as part of a group of 6 African academics. We came to meet political activists, trade unionists, community activists. I decided then that I must return to study this remarkable country. And that return was to be in 2 phases. Sorry, I first came to South Africa in 1991, not even 93. So the return was to be in 2 phases. The first was in 93, when I took a 6-month research fellowship in the Department of Philosophy at UDW. I'd come with a project. I had written a book on Africa. Only 1 chapter needed to be written. This was the chapter on South Africa. And I was to give 6 months to writing this chapter, 6 months of research. But what I learned during those 6 months made me abandon what I had written so far. My big discovery was that apartheid was an animal I already knew. If you'd grown up in any African colony in the 20th century, you had grown up under a version of apartheid. I threw away the book manuscript at the end of my South African 6 months. Threw away the book manuscript I'd come with. I returned to Kampala and I started rewriting. The act of rewriting was an engagement, even a confrontation with 2 kinds of scholarships. The first was an established colonial scholarship. And the second was a South African scholarship deeply rooted in the notion of South African exceptionalism. The idea that South Africa was not a part of Africa, but of the developed world, the Western world, like Australia and New Zealand and Israel. Africa for these scholars lay somewhere north of the Limpopo. I returned to South Africa in 1996 as A.C. Jordan Professor of African Studies at UCT. My journey of discovery, agonizing but also enlightening, continued. I shared my angst with two peers, Archie Mafeje, an old friend from 1980s Codesria, and Paulo Jordan, a new friend whose father's name graced the chair I held at UCT. I discovered that when the South African Academy talked of African studies, they meant the study of the native. The white, the Indian, and the colored experiences were not considered part of African studies. As part of my duties as A.C. Jordan Chair, I was asked to devise an introductory course in African studies, one that would be compulsory for every student entering UCT. The course I proposed was it would have deracialized the notion of South Africa and included the whole South African experience, white, black, Indian, colored, as part of the study of South Africa and Africa. I called for the decolonization of African studies. All hell broke loose. A committee of administrators asked that I revise the curriculum, said that the last part, there were 6 parts, on South Africa should not be taught, since it was being taught in other courses. I refused. Instead of being dictated by an administrative committee meeting behind closed doors, I suggested an open seminar where I would confront my critics publicly. I said peer review was central to academic freedom. The seminar was held. Ibrahim Musa, a colleague in the Department of Religious Studies at UCT, told me afterwards, quote, "There was blood on the floor." It was a hyperbole, but it conveyed some of what had happened. Soon after, in 1999, I was appointed to a named chair at Columbia University in New York City. I accepted. I had left South Africa, but South Africa did not leave me. It continued to shape my academic research and political agenda. No matter where in the world I am, I see the world through lenses crafted in Uganda and in South Africa. Now, today I want to share with you my ongoing quest to understand and learn from the South African journey, and what it means to see the world through South African lenses. I tell the full story in my new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, but this is not an extract from the book. By the way, Neither Settler Nor Native is published by Wits University Press, January 2021. So there is a South African edition. So the point of the story is to answer a larger question. What is the meaning of political decolonization? When I came to UCT in 1996, soon after I was asked to give an inaugural lecture. And I was asked to give a title. And I gave the title. It said, "When does a settler become a native?" So many people were curious. I think they just turned up because of the title. The answer to the question I believed then and still believe is never. The native, I argued, is a creation of the settler state. The native is the settler's invented other. The settler claimed to be not only the product, but also the maker of history at the same time stigmatizing the native as a product of geography, and thus an unthinking captive of an unchanging custom. I argued that settler and native are joined. Neither can exist in isolation. Should you destroy the settler, you will also destroy the native. What defined settlers and natives was not the color of their skin, but the law under which each was governed. Settlers and natives were governed under separate laws. Settlers under civil law and natives under customary law. The claim was that civil law changed with history, and that in contrast, customary law was said to be as unchanging as geography. There was a commonality between both. Both were discriminatory. Civil law was marked by racial discrimination against immigrants. Customary law discriminated against those considered tribal strangers. The important thing is to recognize that, like civil law, customary law too was created by the settler, and that both were discriminatory. You only need to look at the Natal native law of late 19th century. Customary and civil law constituted the backbone of the colonial systems in the US and South Africa. That system is retained in the US today, largely without changes. In South Africa, it was altered significantly, though not fully, in 1994. To understand the difference between US and South Africa, we need to begin with the common legacy that defines both. Settlers in the US got state independence from Britain in 1776. In South Africa, settler state independence came in 1910. Soon after, a South African state delegation visited North America, USA and Canada. The object of the delegation was to study the North American way of containing Indians. The delegation studied the reservation system in North America, and it brought back a blueprint. Even the language did not change much. The North American reservation became the South African Reserve. This reserve was based on an institutional blueprint defined by three major features. One was the assumption that every native must belong to a homeland. Remember I said natives were supposed to be defined by geography, settlers by history. The idea was to take a part of where people had lived at the time of their colonization and declare this part a traditional homeland, and charge the native authority with responsibility to confine the inhabitants to this so-called customary homeland. Settlers were free to move anywhere. In Kiswahili, the word for whites is Mzungu. Now, if you ask yourself, what does Mzungu mean? Mzungu does not refer to the race or the color of the person. Mzungu is a restless person, is a person who never stays in one place. The Waswahili say, hawa wanazunguka kwa nini? Why are these people so restless? Let me go back to the threefold institutional blueprint. First, the homeland, customary homeland. Indians in the US were corralled in reservations, mainly after the Civil War. The same president who is credited with emancipating slaves, Abraham Lincoln, was an Indian hunter in his early life and took the lead in caging remaining Indians in reservations. Remaining means, I should say, surviving Indians after the genocide. Second, a past system that would control the movement of each tribesperson. The homeland functioned like a police state, monitoring the movement of every tribal resident. The pass system, too, was invented in the US, first to control the movement of African slaves, and then of colonized Indians, starting with the Sioux. And three, a language of custom and customary law that cast this modern dictatorship as a traditional legacy. Now, I think we should be clear about one thing when we talk of custom. Historically, custom was observed by society. It was not enforced by the state. So social custom was supposed to be a matter of consent. If you breached custom, you were subject to moral pressure, social pressure, but not sanctions by the state. It is only with colonialism that custom was turned into customary law, and customary law became an artifact of state power. Customary law discriminated between those considered indigenous to the tribal homeland and those designated tribal strangers. The key effect was to limit the right of access to land to only those who could claim to be indigenous to the homeland. Now, let me just point out, African societies, pre-colonial, were not discriminatory. They were far more assimilationist. If you look at the history of the Zulu, assimilation may be coerced assimilation, but it was a completely different trajectory from forced differentiation. Look at the history of the Nguni, how far they spread. Look at the Amhara, look at the Baganda, look at the Hausa. The Baganda started as 4 clans and are today more than 40-some clans. You could become a Muganda. You could become a Hausa. You could become an Amhara. You could become an Arab. You could become a Mswahili. So there was the separation between a Muganda and a non-Muganda, a Zulu and a non-Zulu was a fluid separation. It was not a wall with your belonging determined by descent. Finally, a so-called customary authority that enforced customary law and governed the homeland. The customary authority was accountable to the settler state and not to the population of the homeland. In the US, Indians in reservations do not enjoy the protection of the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution up to today. Even if citizens, reservation Indians are considered wards of the US Congress, They have no enforceable rights. Indians were exempted from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A special act was passed for Indians only, the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, whose provisions are merely advisory to the reservation authority. They are not enforceable rights. The US was a leader in creating different category of citizens. We think of citizens having the same rights, but not in the US. Some have full rights, and others have only limited rights. Before creating Nuremberg laws, Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. But even Hitler considered the one-drop rule that defined Negro identity in the US as too extreme for Germany. I studied the development of apartheid as a state system in my early book, Citizen and Subject. But I want to say something about the anti-apartheid movement before I come on to the present period. An important part of my understanding of political decolonization was the study of the anti-apartheid movement. The language of custom and that of race fractured the political community, not only the language, but also the institutional practice, fractured the political community in South Africa along two lines, race and tribe. The key political challenge of decolonization is how to deal with difference institutionalized and politicized under colonial rule. Race and tribe. How far has the anti-apartheid movement met this goal? This is my question for today. I'll divide the history of the anti-apartheid movement into two phases. The initial phase of anti-apartheid mobilization reproduced the racial political architecture of apartheid. Apartheid had divided the whole population into four so-called population groups: Africans, Indians, coloreds, and whites. Surprisingly, each population group organized as a separate race. They organized according to how they were defined by apartheid. Africans as the African National Congress, ANC. Indians as the Natal Indian Congress of Gandhi. Coloreds as the Colored People's Congress. And whites as Congress of Democrats. Too ashamed to call themselves Congress of Whites. After all, they were anti-apartheid. So they made a change, the others didn't. Subjects of apartheid reproduced the identity enforced by apartheid. Race, in this sense, was a derivative political identity. These racially demarcated resistance groups sometimes worked together under the aegis of the Congress Alliance, whose high point was the ringing declaration of 1955 known as the Freedom Charter. Quote, that particular sentence, South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. This declaration was made by elites who organizationally segregated themselves. Decades would pass before they formally joined under the same organizational structures. It was, for example, only in 1987 that the ANC admitted Indians and coloreds into its National Executive Committee. After Sharpeville, both the ANC and the PSC turned to armed struggle, as would the faithful to a Messiah. dazzled by the success of the Vietnamese communists against all odds, the ANC established Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, in 1961. Closer to home, Mandela and fellow militants looked to Algeria and Angola and Mozambique for inspiration. Mandela visited selected African countries, looking for training opportunities and financial assistance. He recalled the experience in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. A highlight of the trip was Algeria. In Mandela's words, quote, the closest model to our own. So you can see how Mandela was thinking at that period. But that is where the resemblance between Algeria and South Africa ended. The decades that followed would record a sharp difference in both the nature of the struggle and its outcome in the two countries. Faced with the reality of an independent Algeria, 1 million Pieds Noirs would leave for France. Pieds Noirs, the settlers. Blackfeet. In South Africa, however, most settlers would stay, becoming part of the post-apartheid political community. The difference between South Africa and Algeria is worth exploring. I can only say a few words about what made for the difference. One, the armed struggle resulted in crackdowns on militant leaders like Mandela, who were imprisoned or forced into exile. In prison and exile, armed liberators lost connection with the very constituencies whose challenges they were committed to addressing. Communities, in turn, found themselves more or less leaderless for a time. The decade of the 60s was a decade when active resistance subsided and foreign capital flooded South Africa. The second difference with Algeria was the symbolic nature of the armed struggle in South Africa. This single fact opened the South African vista to new possibilities. Which is what I call the second phase. It is the second phase. In the first phase, South Africa can be read as more or less trying to recreate what had happened elsewhere. Vietnam, Algeria, Mozambique, Angola. The second phase is the creative moment. It is the second phase that led to what I call the South African moment. And by the South African moment, I refer to the period in the 1970s and 1980s when political initiative shifted from apartheid authorities to anti-apartheid forces. The South African moment unfolded in three phases. The first was the move from resisting within the terms set by apartheid governance to redefining these terms. Second was a shift of focus from demanding an end to apartheid to providing an alternative to apartheid. Third was a change in how anti-apartheid movements represented themselves, from representatives of the oppressed black majority to representatives of the whole people. Over the 2 decades that followed Mandela's trial and imprisonment, there was a sea change in South African politics. The most important force for this change was not the armed struggle, nor exile politics, nor the international boycott movement. That force was provided by student activists of all colors and by migrant and township labor. It was a worker-student alliance. Students and workers crafted a vision that exploded the narrow confines into which each had been slotted by the architects of apartheid. Standing outside the strictures of workday routines, students were free to think beyond their specific stations in life. These students recalled the late 19th century Russian middle-class intellectuals who merged with the people, narodniks. Migrant workers, straddling the urban and the rural, moved between the lash of customary law and the disciplinary hold of civil law, and for that same reason were not fully controlled by either. These groups rejuvenated popular protest and shattered the silence of the graveyard that was the 1960s. Despite obvious differences among them, they made common cause during important actions such as the Durban strikes of 1973. Together, they moved the locus of struggle from exiled professional revolutionaries and imprisoned fighters to popular strata in South Africa's communities. They brought the struggle back home. They also replaced an aborted guerrilla movement with nonviolent agitation to enormous effect. By acting peacefully, they maintained the moral high ground and distinguished themselves from an obviously violent system of oppression. Although they did not end apartheid on their own, they created the social and political paralysis that forced South Africa's white rulers to capitulate, and in 1990, open negotiations. I should say, forced South Africa's white rulers to open negotiations. The student and worker uprising marked a shift, not only in South Africa, but in the whole paradigm of liberation struggle globally. This shift preceded the Intifada that shook occupied Palestine in the 1980s. And it certainly preceded Eastern Europe's largely non-violent revolutions of that same decade. Student initiatives were instrumental in negotiating color lines. Non-white students had earlier joined the liberal wing of the white student movement, NUSAS, but soon left to come together under the banner of blackness. This was the work of the Black Consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko. Biko and other African students who had joined NUSAS chafed at the paternalism and hegemony of the group's white organizers and struck out on their own. They founded the South African Students' Organization, a group open only to blacks. While this may have seemed like a reinvestment in apartheid, it was not. For by blacks, Biko and others promoting black consciousness meant African, Indian, and colored students. Black consciousness was a historic rupture with the mindset of apartheid. Black, Biko argued, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you are black. I was pleased to hear the Vice Chancellor inform us, at least inform me, that this was Steve Biko Week. It's an honor to speak during Steve Biko Week. The departure of black youth from NUSAS created a crisis for progressive white students. Unlike disenchanted white liberals of previous generations, they too reached out across the color line to mobilize wider sections of society against apartheid. Like prophets outcast, they searched for a constituency. Shut out of black consciousness organizations and black townships, they turned to migrant worker hostels on the fringes of townships. Radical white students played a catalytic role in the development of independent unions that began the avalanche which eventually brought down apartheid. Militant black and white students had more in common than they realized. None was keen to join externally based organizations or to court state repression by proclaiming allegiance to an outlawed group. None heeded the argument, then fashionable in, quote, liberation circles, that anything short of armed struggle or underground struggle, anything smacking of agitation for reforms or open organizational work, was tantamount to a recognition of the apartheid state and capitulation to it. They wanted to make change, not to be confined to jails. Their key partners in this effort, the migrant workers, seemed to knit the disparate strands of South Africa into one piece. Their meandering lives from Bantustan homes to miserable hostels and work environments brought into contact people from the rural and the urban and from different parts of South Africa. Unwilling to stake the little they had, they did not turn to armed struggle, even as it was registering its most spectacular gains with the collapse of Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique and Angola. Instead, they went on strike. In December 1971, thousands of Ovambo contract workers struck in Walvis Bay and Windhoek, two cities in Namibia, which was then a South African protectorate. They struck in order to protest the suffering caused by the migrant labor system that was so instrumental to apartheid. In the following month, their protest grew into a general strike involving some 20,000 migrant workers. Then followed the strike wave of 1973-74 in South Africa. Beginning in industrial complexes in Pinetown, New Germany, Jacobs, Mobeni, and elsewhere, it was unstoppable. The strike movement was like a magnet that attracted hitherto dispersed migrant workers, African, colored, and Indian, into a collective effort that eventually took the form of independent unions. The initiative that included white students, in particular those in the benefit fund, accelerated unionization that followed the Durban strikes. As more unions were formed, they put members of the benefit fund executive committee on their own boards and recruited organizers from benefit fund ranks. In 1979, industrial unions started banding together under Fossatu. Within 2 years, Fossatu counted 95,000 members in 387 organized factories spread across Natal, the Transvaal, and the Cape. In retrospect, white students made for a first crack in white political consciousness in apartheid South Africa. White activists challenged apartheid's claim that there could be no white security without a white monopoly on power. Indeed, they suggested that the reverse may be true, that whites could be more secure if they gave up their monopoly and the strife it caused. Imperceptibly, the shift of white radicals from workerist organizing to public outreach set in motion the realization of a non-racial future. On the heels of the strike wave of 1974-75 followed the Soweto uprising of 1976. Soweto proved a coming of age for Black community organizing. The organizers and marchers inspired a generation of community-based resistance. Mandela writes in his memoirs, Long Walk to Freedom, that he learned from his wife, Winnie, quote, that there was a rising class of discontented youths who were militant and Africanist in orientation. She said they were changing the nature of the struggle and that I should be aware of them. He's learning from Winnie. He's a bystander. Mandela wrote a revealing account of prison encounters with one such youth. I quote from Mandela. The isolation section was filled with young men who had been arrested in the aftermath of the uprising. These young men were a different breed of prisoner from those we had seen before. They were brave, hostile, and aggressive. They would not take orders and shouted "Amanla" at every opportunity in jail. Their instinct was to confront rather than cooperate. The authorities did not know how to handle them, and they turned the island upside down. Shortly after their arrival on the island, the commanding officer came to me and asked me as a favor to address the young men. He wanted me to tell them to restrain themselves, to recognize the fact that they were in prison, and to accept the discipline of prison life. I told him that I was not prepared to do that. Under the circumstances, they would have regarded me as a collaborator of the oppressor. These fellows refused to conform to even basic prison regulations. One day I was at the head office conferring with the commanding officer. As I was walking out with the major, we came upon a young prisoner being interviewed by a prison official. The young man, who was no more than 18, was wearing his prison cap in the presence of senior officers, a violation of regulations. Nor did he stand up when the major entered the room, another violation. The major looked at him and said, "Please take off your cap." The prisoner ignored him. Then, in an irritated tone, the major said, "Take off your cap." The prisoner turned and looked at the major and said, "What for?" I could hardly believe what I had just heard. It was a revolutionary question. What for? The major also seemed taken aback, but managed to reply. "It is against regulations," he said. The young prisoner responded, "Why do you have this regulation? What is the purpose of it?" This questioning on the part of the prisoner was too much for the major, and he stomped out of the room saying, "Mandela, you talk to him." But I would not intervene on his behalf and simply bowed in the direction of the prisoner to let him know that I was on his side. The generational difference between Nelson and Winnie was not just one of age. It was also a difference between political generations and political orientation. Nelson was shaped by sharp will and the vision of the revolutionary as a professional exile. Winnie was shaped more by Soweto and the vision of the revolutionary as a community activist, fish among water, to use Mao's language. By the mid-1980s, the townships had become ungovernable. The insurrection involved a loosely organized coalition of community and work-based organizations, with the UDF at the helm, or with the UDF as the umbrella. The UDF brought together local groups all over the country to engage in peaceful protests of various forms: work stoppages, student protests, rent strikes. It cooperated with COSATU and other non-racial organizations. Above all, it was a focal point for a popular movement very much underway. But it did not go the whole course. There were negotiations. Why did the apartheid regime begin looking for a negotiating partner? I suggest this was for two reasons. One was that the wave of a popular mobilization was still in its early phase, confined to urban areas, even then relatively decentralized. Negotiations would provide an opportunity both to address its fault lines and to dam the waters before they reached the rural areas. Second was the realization that the regime was losing the support of important sections of the white intelligentsia, and that if this continued, it would risk an erosion of its white support base. This was the background to discussions between official representatives and Nelson Mandela on the twin issues of majority rule and minority rights. I want to pause here and take stock of the situation with the township uprising at the end of the 80s. The uprising, it turned into a civil war, which had severely fractured.
Mamdani, just to do a quick time check and say that you've got less than a minute left, but I'm sure you can just finish that thought.
Wow. I was told I could take an hour, and I thought I didn't begin until 12:20 my time here. So
no, we actually have you down for 45 minutes, but I think if you can start to wrap up, that would be good. Thanks.
That's okay. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
And it's just to allow for some questions and answers. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that presently where politics certainly in South Africa seems to be going, but also elsewhere on the African continent, the notion that of this interdependence and actually the co-constitution between the settler identity and the native identity, I think would be controversial for some. I think for some people it would be very difficult to think that an identity, particularly native identities that feel very much part of the self and feel very much even primordial, that those are actually a result of this colonial co-constitution that you so brilliantly capture for us. And we see definitely in the South African context, but I think we've seen it in the post-colonial context on the African continent more generally, a return to what people have called nativism, or a sense of an essentialist sense of blackness, of indigeneity. And so I thought to just kick us off with a question. I think that you posed a very important question to us around decolonization. And that decolonization, the question of decolonization is about how to deal with the difference that has been demarcated and imposed on, for example, on us here in South Africa, but also elsewhere. We see definitely in democratic South Africa a return, or not even a return, a reproduction of this bifurcation that you talk about between citizen and subject, or then settler native, and you are aware, I'm sure, of all these customary laws that we've been passing over the past how many years, since 1994, a plethora of laws of which one has been rejected by the Constitutional Court, another one, the Traditional Courts Bill, has been rejected many times actually in Parliament, and I think finally went through recently. We've got the Khoisan and Traditional Leadership Act that was adopted recently, and so on. So we see, and that is creating that parallel legal system that you're talking about, where people who happen to be black and rural and living under a chief are now still confined and actually don't enjoy the same rights as South Africans in urban areas. And the African National Congress has not just embraced this, but has been a very strong supporter and of the continuation of the system. How should we make sense of that now, given what we are trying to achieve here, which is the decolonization of our country? How should we make sense of political elites that opt for continuations like that, like we are seeing here in South Africa? Just to kick us off, please.
Well, that was the second part of my lecture. So if you don't mind, I will read the last 3 pages, which will not take as much time as you have taken with your question. The challenge of the anti-apartheid movement has so far been its inability to engage productively with the question of tribe. The 1994 transition succeeded in reforming the central state, organized around race as a political identity. But it did not reform the local state, organized around tribe as a political identity. The alliance of settlers and customary authorities scored key victories at CODESA, with recognition of the Zulu monarchy and of, quote, indigenous and customary law as the implementation of the Local Government Transition Act of 1993. This alliance also gained from the entrenchment of private property in the post-apartheid constitution, an entrenchment that presumes tribal identity. Under the post-apartheid system, land rights within the former Bantustans are inherited from colonial customary law, which allows only members of the tribal political community to own property. That means adult men in the former Bantustans can own land, but youth, women, and strangers, meaning any African considered non-indigenous, cannot. Though the constitution abolished the Bantustan as a political structure, it sanctioned apartheid-created customary law as the basis of governance in former Bantustans. The irony is that any African man or woman has the right to own land outside the former Bantustans, but that right is restricted within the Bantustan by customary law. In South Africa, tribe has been naturalized, presumed to be part of a timeless native, that is African culture. In the former Bantustans, the regime of customary law remains substantially unreformed. Africans are still denied rights under the customary regime, should they live in the wrong tribal homeland. The more important point, however, is the contradiction between political and legal rules in the post-1994 South Africa. All of South Africa is governed under an electoral political democracy, but all of South Africa is not governed under a single rule of law. The law is different in the former Bantustans. As has been amply evident in independent Africa since the 1950s, you cannot have two different and contradictory set of legal rules in the same country. Much as the rural follows the urban politically, the rural is also bound to contaminate the urban. In rural South Africa, violence continues among Africans, defined as tribally distinct. In urban South Africa, Africans and other persons of color seen as tribal strangers, and thus intruders, are periodically the target of what is called xenophobic violence. It is no surprise that the target of extreme violence in the post-apartheid era has been the tribal rather than the racial stranger. I would like us to reflect on developments since the majority rule elections of 1994. A key question in those elections was, who has the right to vote? There were two positions. One said only citizens should be able to vote. The position was that all residents, since they pay taxes and are governed under South African law, should have the right to vote. At stake were the political rights of migrant labor who had been organized for decades, from the time of ICU in the 1920s to that of Fossatu in the 1970s. Then came the post-apartheid government with Inkatha and Gatche Buthelezi taking charge of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. There followed a whole host of administrative rules disenfranchising migrants. Alongside it was a massive ideological campaign directed at citizens that if they were poor, it was because what rightfully was theirs was being given to migrants or taken by migrants. Acts of xenophobic violence in South Africa have been recurrent since 1994, starting with attacks against undocumented African migrants in Alexandra Township. May 2008 saw a larger break of the same in the province of Gauteng and then in Durban and Cape Town. After King Goodwill Zwelithini's March 21, 2015 declaration that foreigners should go back to their home countries because they were enriching themselves at the expense of ordinary South Africans, thousands were evicted and dozens were killed in the process. Ask yourself why the violence is directed in the main at the tribal stranger and not the racial stranger. And the answer will point to the unfinished political agenda in South Africa, democratizing rural power. Let me conclude. What happened in South Africa should be seen not as a social revolution stymied, but as the most far-reaching and far-sighted transition to political independence in the colonial world. If we focus too much on the missed opportunity for social justice, then we will blind ourselves to the revolution that may take place, the political revolution. To grasp this, we need to move from the language of social justice to the language of decolonization. The anti-apartheid struggle is a radical attempt to imagine a decolonial political community, one that is neither a return to the imagined pre-colonial nation nor a continuation of the colonial condition. Decolonization in the political domain is not a return to the pre-colonial, but a conscious and creative engagement to recognize and reckon with the changes wrought by colonialism. As I've already argued, the glass is both half full and half empty. If the gains of 1994 included equality of political rights and the operation of a single rule of law in the urban areas, the promise has yet to be realized in rural areas. There, the continued reproduction of customary law and customary authority ensures a regime of privilege and discrimination based on tribal identity. Though instituted under apartheid, this is defended as a way to honor the legacy of pre-colonial Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a few questions that that actually I think traverse the same terrain plus minus. From Professor Bond, we have, could it be that we are dealing with two challenges, the unfinished business of both the UDF and the TRC, hence the consolidation of the political economy of apartheid that now has to be undone? And then from Professor Sailu, along a similar line, how do you, Professor Mamdani, read prospects for reforming or transforming the post-Marokana neo-apartheid state? So I think this speaks directly to your concluding comments.
You want me to speak about that?
Please do.
Okay. Yeah. The unfinished business is twofold. One is political, the other is social. The unfinished business of UDF is a single rule of law over the entire territory of South Africa, which would undergird a political community with political freedoms. As I said, this has been realized in a legal and formal sense in urban South Africa, but it has not been realized in the Bantustans. The second unfinished business, the question of social equality, this is at the heart of the ongoing discussion in South Africa today. And my argument has always been that social equality, or a successful campaign to realize social redistribution and generate a modicum of social equity, would have called for a revolution, would have called for a balance of forces, which would have been tantamount to a revolution. Well, that balance of forces wasn't there, which is why there were negotiations, which is why there was a stalemate, and which is why there was a compromise. I am not even sure that had there been an attempt by the left in 1994 to push through a demand and call for la luta continua onto social revolution, I am not sure the result would have been social revolution. The result would more likely have been civil war and bloodshed. Civil war which would have divided the country along two lines of privilege and disprivilege, one racial, the other tribal. We are already seeing a kind of a tribal civil war unfold as xenophobic violence, but it would have been combined with a racial civil war, something far more deadly. I believe that the political revolution, as opposed to a social revolution, if it is successful, in completing the agenda of the political agenda of the UDS, if it is successful in creating not only a regime of equal political rights, but also a regime of rule of law for everybody, then that would create the basis for a coalition which would cut across racial and tribal lines. As for Americana, I think you are better placed to answer it than I am. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So would you agree with the typification by Professor Solo that we're living in a neo-apartheid state, that even though, because I know your emphasis is on the political change, Professor Mamdani, and the political breakthrough that was achieved in the 1990s, but if one looks at the socioeconomic situation, then many people are reading it as a situation of a continuation of apartheid and apartheid relations not really being transformed. Would you agree that one should typify this condition that we find ourselves in now as a new apartheid?
I would use a different language. To the extent that apartheid continues as a legal and political structure, it continues in the Bantustans, in the former Bantustans, not in the urban areas. So to the extent we have a neo-apartheid state, apartheid exists in the form of state-enforced tribalism, state-enforced tribal privilege and tribal discrimination. That's the neo-apartheid state. The question of socio-economic situation, the current socio-economic situation, without the apartheid order in the Bantustans, it would be equivalent to a capitalist society with apartheid as its historical background. Admittedly, one of the most inegalitarian capitalist society in the world. I remember when I came to UCT in 1996, I remember reading a report of the UNDP, the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index said that if white South Africa were a separate country, it would be 14th in the world in its Human Development Index. And if black South Africa were a separate country, it would be 114th below Congo in the Human Development Index. Now, there you are.
Okay, thank you for that. We do have a comment here from Stephanie Brown saying, what role do you believe restitution plays in moving forward in post-apartheid South Africa, and any views on how this can take place? I did ask you to elaborate a bit on what she means by restitution, but if you would, I'm assuming state-driven restitution to redress apartheid inequalities and injustices. Yeah, any thoughts from your side on that, Professor?
Sure. Look, I understand that the big interest is in socioeconomic inequality and how to address socioeconomic inequality. Look, you had an institution called the TRC. The TRC was asked to look at violation of human rights. And the TRC decided that violation of human rights, TRC decided to look at violence. But when it looked at violence, it severed the connection between violence and socioeconomic advantage. because what the TRC did was it sought to identify only the perpetrators of violence, not the beneficiaries of violence. Okay. The perpetrators of violence were particular people, and they were individuals. So the TRC focused only on violence carried out by agents of the state. The TRC worked within the parameters of human rights framework of violence as a criminal act. And in criminal law, the state cannot be a criminal. Crime is defined by state law. Only agents of the state can carry out crime. So crime is necessarily an individual activity. The second thing is that by focusing on perpetrators and not beneficiaries, the TRC missed a golden opportunity to build a bridge between 1994 and what should come later. Because by focusing on perpetrators, individual perpetrators, the TRC made most of the vast majority of the white population feel that they were not guilty. If only we had known. We just didn't know. Right? But that's not true. If you look at beneficiaries, every white person benefited from apartheid, whether it was the taxes they paid, or where they lived, or the law under which they lived, or the schools they went to. The list is ad infinitum. Regardless of their politics, whether they were supporting apartheid or opposed to apartheid, even white members of the Communist Party were among the beneficiaries of apartheid. But petty beneficiaries, you could make a distinction between large-scale beneficiaries, the big corporations, etc., and the petty beneficiaries. But the point is that if the apartheid, if TRC had approached its agenda and looked at not only the violence carried out by individual agents of the state, but also the violence enabled by state law, the discussion would have led straight to beneficiaries. It didn't. So my first point is that that bridge was never built between political rights and socioeconomic restitution, addressing social inequality. A constituency was never prepared in that sense. Well, that's what's happening now. It's what's happening now in the face of adverse circumstances, because in the meanwhile, you've had what was called a black empowerment. You have had, as to some extent, a deracialization of and a coming together of beneficiaries of apartheid with the beneficiaries of the post-apartheid state. Situation is a little more complicated.
Yes, indeed. Very complicated. We have a question here from our colleague Ntombi Wantwi, saying, thank you, Professor Mamdani. Can you please speak on the settlers' responsibility when it comes to justice, redistribution, and social cohesion in South Africa?
Well, I just did.
Oh.
I think my last answer should be taken as an answer to both these questions. But let me just say, I don't mean to be offensive. If there's something that I didn't address in my last answer, please feel free to speak up, and I'll be happy to talk about it.
Okay, Ntombi, if Ntombi wants to add anything, she's welcome to do so in the Q&A. And then we have a question from Banwi Fokwa saying, thank you for the insightful lecture. Please, can you explain the fact that previous xenophobic attacks on foreigners and foreign business establishment in South Africa received less. It seems like it cut off there. But I'm assuming that the person is concerned with how government is responding in South Africa to xenophobia and xenophobic attacks. I don't know if you want to. And then we have another question here from Dr. Vilakazi.
I'll respond to it.
Okay.
So, you know, there are many ways to respond to xenophobic attacks, but of these, two are important. One is a response which stays within the terms of the linguistic world in which xenophobic attacks make sense. In other words, this response identifies perpetrators and victims in ethnic terms. If you politicize ethnicity, you get in tribal terms. So this tribe is attacking this tribe. That's one way of formulating. But the other way of formulating is to ask yourself, how come the violence is taking this particular form? You see, there are a number of people who have argued that the violence is because of the failure at socioeconomic reform, and that these are attacks of the disprivileged. They're taking out their extreme frustration and their opposition to the status quo. That may be, but why are they taking it out as ethnic groups? Why are they taking out as a particular ethnic group against another particular ethnic group? Why not? There is no organization of class against class. I saw this in the Rwanda genocide, but I will not talk about that now, unless somebody is interested. But so if you ask yourself, how come the violence is organized along ethnic lines and the targets of violence are being defined along ethnic lines? And the answer then forces you to go outside of the language of ethnicity to then look at how state law and the structure of the state has organized people. It forces you to look at Bantustans and the modes of organization of Bantustans, the ethnic, tribal modes of organization of Bantustans, of the law in the Bantustans, the customary law, which makes it legal and natural that resources belong to ethnic groups, and that what would otherwise seem outside of the Bantustans as a kind of discrimination, whether in favor of racial or ethnic group, now seems as the normal operation of the law. So it forces you to look at the underlying structure, and it forces you to think in terms of reforms which would be structural reforms. I hope that says something about your question.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from Dr. Sorovia where she's asking, she's particularly referring to the subtitle of your latest book, Political Community Beyond Majorities and Minorities. She's saying, how do you envision this new political community beyond majorities and minorities?
Great question, to which I wish I had a great answer. So I've described the problem, right? Which is the capture of the state by the nation. If you go to 1994, right? That debate in 1994 as to who should have the right to vote. The two sides in that debate, one says citizen, the other says resident. After I'd written the book, in fact, after the book had been published, I wished that I had addressed this question in some detail in the conclusion, because the citizen is a category of the nation state. The resident is a category far more appropriate to a state which is not captured by a nation. Because citizenship requires more than residence. It requires beyond residence. Questions of birth, questions of descent, and whatever else. Residence is just that, residence. We live in a world in which the question of migrants is becoming hugely volatile and rapidly a central question, in a sense. And this world poses to us now, beyond the question of rights of citizens, rights of migrants. So to get back to your question, I don't really have a blueprint. Partly I don't have a blueprint because that's not the way I work. I don't see myself as a conventional political theorist. A conventional political theorist basically believes that the job of a political theorist is to come out with the design of the good society. What should the good society look like? I don't believe in that. I have an interest in the good society, but I don't think its design can be manufactured in the splendid isolation of the study of a professor, an academic, or a scholar. I believe that the outlines of its design should be glimpsed in the struggle of actual movements on the ground. And I totally understand that actual movements will not give us a fully finished answer, that whatever they give us will be the raw materials of an answer, that this raw material will be internally contradictory, and that it is the task of the professor to sift through, the task of the scholar, excuse me, to sift through this contradictory material and bring out possibilities, which is why I don't think that it's a question of returning to what was before the colonial. No, it will not work, because the colonial has brought to us a whole set of challenges which we need to take into account. I hope that gives some kind of an answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We have some comments from Derek Fay, who says that he agrees with most of your analysis, Professor Mamdani, but he says, I have to take issue with the characterization of customary law as stagnant and state-imposed, which I don't think that you are characterizing it as such. And then he refers to the work of Aninka Claassen and Sindiso Mnisi Weeks. And he's also talking about the core challenges that we've seen to the static versions of customary law, this is the traditional courts bill, and so forth and so on.
Well, at one point in my talk, I made a distinction between custom and customary law. And customary law by definition, is state-imposed. I mean, the state may draw the raw material of it from many different places, but law by definition is the will of the state. Law is not the will of the community. And custom is, much more what you're talking about. So if you look at the debates on customary law, the colonial debates on customary law, most sort of the most honest of colonial anthropologists kept asking themselves, where do we find out what was customary law? And one way to do is to look at lived reality, lived life, quotidian life. But of course, lived reality is contradictory in many ways. And the other way they thought was to ask, but to ask the oldest people. So they would look for the elders, the aged, and ask them, what was custom on this? What was custom on that? So one thing is the content of the law, but more important than the content of the law is the enforcer of the law. Because a single unitary law-defining and law-making authority is a product of the absolutist state. And it's well known that in the African context, the absolutist state only came into existence with colonialism or at a period just barely before that. That in fact in the colonial period, there was not one but many law enforcing agencies. So that, for example, the enforcement of land, the governance of land and distribution of land would be by clans. The enforcement of mobilization for fighting, etc., would be by either age groups or following age groups, the fighting regiments themselves. The governance of the marketplace, for example, if you take West Africa, most often by women's groups. In other words, there were many enforcing agencies, and also at the same time many customary laws, many. To not contradict myself, let me say customary rules, because there were these agencies and they did enforce rules, many customary rules. But with colonialism, there was only one single agency, the chief, none other, just one single agency, the chief. And that probably was a far more significant change than happened before. If you look at another regime of customary law, look at English common law. English common law is supposed to be customary law. But in English common law, the rules are very different. English common law insists that you recognize that there are multiple interpretations of custom in any community, and that the enforcing authority take into account multiple interpretations, not under colonial law. Okay, not under colonial. You can take another kind of customary law, put it in quotes, Sharia. Sharia is another kind of custom, which is because Sharia before colonialism is custom of the community. It's not the law enforced. The law enforced by the state is called Qanun, coming from canon law of the church. But again, you have a very similar transformation taking place from community-based custom, multiple, various, to state-based law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Mamdani, are you happy to still continue for a little bit? We are over time, but how are you doing for time?
It depends on you, because you had a very strict regime on overtime earlier on. You can now decide what your rules are. And you can we do try to keep to the time, I have to admit. But Dr. Vilakazi has got a question here about the role of women and feminist leadership in the decolonial project as aligned to the symbolism
of Winnie Mandela's version of the revolution in South Africa. That's, yeah, and I think there's maybe just a comment from your side, or I don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, it's a very broad question, but many people have commented on the gender question in liberation movements, and one thing, at least in my reading, common to these commentaries has been that during the period of struggle, during the time of opposition, and therefore the time of mobilization, etc., all the leadership roles and existing monopolies tended to be broken down, and you had which included the breaking down of patriarchy, which meant not only more women coming to the fore, but also more young people coming to the fore. And so you will get writing in East Africa, you get writing in Algeria, you get writing in many places in India, you get writing which shows that as soon as they attained independence, the opening sort of closed, well, it kind of states the problem for us, and it becomes a larger question of what kind of emancipatory possibilities arise beyond feminism, including feminism, arise during the period of the anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggle, and what is the closure after that? Yeah, let me just stop there.
Thank you so much. We do have I think we can wrap up if you're happy to do so. We do with a final question from Professor Janet.
I'm happy to continue. I'm happy to
continue. Okay. Oh, well, great. Then,
and answer questions. Yes.
Let me ask our audience to please post some more questions. We do have from Professor Janet Cherry. She was commenting on what you were saying earlier about violence in South Africa, and she was saying that most violence in South Africa is not committed along racial or ethnic lines. And then she elaborated and said that we do have xenophobic violence against non-citizens, but most violence is committed within communities and homes, including but not only GBV. So I think she was understanding you to be saying that most of our violence is racial or ethnic in nature.
I think that's a good question. Look, I am not talking of violence within the home. Okay. Obviously, there's a lot of sexual violence within the home. I'm not even talking of violence within the community. So I'm not talking of violence, sort of with a capital V, in all domains. I'm not. My interest is really in violence between defined groups, okay? Whether they are defined as racial. See, the book I wrote, I mean, I've been working on genocide, on extreme violence, and so I've been looking at extreme violence between political identities, mostly defined in racial terms, or ethnic terms, or religious terms. And when I was writing this book, I asked myself, what about gender? And I didn't write down what I thought, because what I thought was unfinished. But my thought was this: I couldn't imagine a genocide based on gender, because I can't imagine men wanting to kill all women, because that would be the end of society. Plenty of examples of people of one religion wanting to kill people of another religion, people of one race wanting to kill another race, people of one ethnic group wanting to kill another, but not gender. I think is gender, and gender violence is, it precedes the formation of the state. It precedes the formation of political power. It's rooted right inside the family, which race and ethnicity and these things are not rooted. So it requires a deeper search, a more fundamental search in a way, a deeper historical understanding. But most of all, it should warn us against the study of gender violence as an add-on project. It can't be an add-on project. It brings forth a whole set of challenges which defines the ways in which it is different, and more challenging. So I both agree with you, and I try to explain why I'm not really talking about it.
Thank you for that, Professor. We've got some comments here from Professor Melanie Judge saying misogyny is the slowest of aspirational genocides. I hope she will add some more on that. And then Professor Mkhize is saying, I tend to agree, though, the need for women to do the sex labor of birth means somewhere they stop short. So that's the comments from our audience. I don't know if you want to say anything more in relation to that.
Well, I don't know. Misogyny as genocide. It's kind of an inflation of language, which I don't think will help us. So if everything becomes genocide, if everything becomes violence, now we talk about rhetorical violence, we talk about all kinds of violences. So everything is violence. Well, then how are we going to talk about violence? Everything is genocide. How are we going to talk about genocide? So I mean, I just apologize. I can't. The language of this does not open it up for me. So sorry.
Okay, maybe one should call it a slow burning terror or something like that, misogyny. We've got Michael Uash asking a question: where do you see meaningful progress in those societies that adopted a form of liberal democratic state design in overcoming colonial and or imperial legacies and devising governance solutions to overcome the legacies of decentralized despotism? It's quite a complicated question. I'll repeat. Where do you see meaningful progress in those societies that adopted a form of liberal democratic state design to overcome colonial legacies, to overcome the legacies of decentralized despotism?
Look,
so is liberal democracy the answer here?
Yeah, for me, liberal democracy is not the answer. I'll tell you why. So to the extent that liberal democracy talks of upholding individual rights, I'm all for it. But the liberal democracy is more than that. Liberalism and liberal democracy, very suspicious of group identities. But there is only one group identity that liberal democracy assumes as natural, and that's the nation. It's just like somebody earlier was talking about how, oh, sorry, you were talking about how, you, the moderator, were talking about how tribalism is indigenous, it's natural, it's a part of cultural legacy, etc. Liberalism considers the nation as natural. It's the only group identity, the nation state, as natural, starting with John Locke. So that part of liberalism, I don't buy. Well, I think that I am getting a bit tired, and I do have a technician coming here in 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. Just to clarify, I don't think tribalism is natural, homogeneity or anything like that. I was talking about a kind of a native turn that we are definitely seeing in South Africa, but also that we've seen in other countries on the African continent. So just to clarify that. But I think, shall we wrap up? We're almost at the hour, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, almost 7 o'clock here in the evening in South Africa. It's quite a bit earlier there on your side, Professor Mamdani. I just want to thank you very deeply for making this time to talk to us this evening, and also being so generous in sharing your insights with us. And I'm seeing many little claps going up here. We managed to maintain almost 100 people in the audience. So I think people have been very appreciative and have really enjoyed your insights this evening. And of course, much of what Professor Mamdani was saying, one can find in his latest book, and I would encourage anybody that has not yet had the opportunity to read it to really do make an effort. South Africa also features in very interesting ways, as he's spoken about this evening, and gives us much to think about as South Africans, and confronts us a bit in terms of our own skepticism and even cynicism about our country. So thank you so much, Professor Mamdani.
Thank you. May I ask, I have a query. You said at the beginning, introducing me, that I'd been awarded the Herskovits Prize for this book or for an earlier book?
In terms of the bio that we received,
for an earlier book. That's for an earlier book.
Was it for an earlier book? Okay,
yes,
so I think
for
that's
citizen and subject. Yeah.
Right.
For citizen subject. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think there was a problem in the bio. All right. But anyway, I'm sure this book will also be awarded. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to everybody who attended this. And please feel free to drop me an email if you have a question which was not answered. Okay? Bye.
That's very kind of you. Thank you to our audience. Thank you so much. Have a good evening or a good day, wherever you might be. As people are leaving, do join us tomorrow morning at 8:45 for our first full day session. And we'll be looking at constitutionalism and democracy. We have Professor Zweleti Jolobe joining us, and a number of other speakers. I think it's going to be a very rich session. So please join us then.